Newsfirst, Newsline.
Hello there and a very good evening. Welcome to tonight's edition of Newsfirst Newsline here on TV1. Joining you today, I am Geopolitical. As you know, tomorrow an interim budget will be presented by President Ranil Wickremesinghe in Parliament in his capacity as the Finance Minister. However, budgets that were presented by successive governments in the past have overpromised but underdelivered. And to put this into context, the budget presented in 2021, out of all of the promises and the allocations made in 2021's budget, only 6% of expenditure proposals were classified as fulfilled. This is based on a research conducted by Verite Research, and this accentuates the problem and have in many ways led to Sri Lanka's economic crisis and also public confidence in the authorities and the administration being eroded. To discuss tomorrow's interim budget, how this budget can be different from budgets of the past, we have invited to our Newsline tonight Dr. W.A. Wijewardena, former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank. Thank you very much, Doctor, for joining us tonight, and a very good evening to you.
Thank you, Jamal, and thank you very much for having me on this program.
Doctor, on the outset of tonight's program, I want to ask you, yes, tomorrow's budget is an interim budget. The full appropriation bill for the year 2023 will be presented in November. However, how can tomorrow's budget put Sri Lanka on a path of sustainable recovery? How can tomorrow's budget ensure the citizenry? How can the President and the Finance Ministry ensure Sri Lanka's citizenry that Sri Lanka will finally be put on a progressive and a path towards development? What sort of physical measures should they take in order to bring this confidence about amongst people?
Jamal, as you very correctly mentioned that it will be an interim budget. The main reason for the presentation of this interim budget is the non-fulfillment of the promises that had been made in the budget for 2022, presented to Parliament in November 2021. Because there is a new government in power under the presidency of Wickremesinghe, he may have thought that he cannot work with the old budget, which has not been able to fulfill its promises. And therefore, he had thought that for the next 3 months time period, he needs a new budget. In fact, in the new budget, Jamal, the main promises are that he has increased the expenditure program. And at the same time, because of the revenue gap in the budget in the past, he will have to introduce new tax measures to increase the revenue. But given the total expenditure and the total income that he would be getting, one can, say that in advance that the budget will not have the necessary resources to finance all the expenditure programs.
So, Doctor, speaking about tomorrow's budget and the President in his capacity as the Finance Minister, Reuters published an article earlier today saying that the President is set to slash expenditure by a few hundred billion rupees, including on defence, to channel such funds to social welfare and also to pay interest on loans. How do you view this, Doctor?
Well, of course, if he walks the talk that he will slash the expenditure program, that's a good thing for Sri Lanka. But what has happened, Jayamal, in the past is any expenditure cut has taken place not in the recurrent expenditure, which we call the consumption expenditure of the government, but in the capital expenditure of the government. Now, even in this budget, most probably during the next 3 month time period, the capital expenditure would be slashed because in accordance with the circular issued by the Ministry of Finance about 2 months ago, all the capital expenditure projects of the government had been stopped. So, present government also under Ranil Wickremesinghe will move forward in those lines, and as a result what we can expect is a slashing of not the recurrent expenditure or the current consumption expenditure, but the capital expenditure, which will have far-reaching adverse repercussions on the long-term economic growth of Sri Lanka.
Right, Doctor, let me direct our attention towards something that has been much talked about these days, especially in light of the economic crisis in Sri Lanka. Social welfare. You know, most of our citizenry, a lot of the people, a lot of our own citizens have been pushed into poverty as a result of skyrocketing cost of living and whatnot. How can this interim budget allocate sufficient funds to support impoverished communities? What sort of subsidies can be given? What sort of schemes can be implemented to support the most vulnerable groups in our society?
Well, in the first place, there will be some cash grants which will be given to those people who have been affected by the loss of income as well as increase in prices. Then there are some sectors like fisheries, agriculture, and the small and medium enterprises, micro enterprises, where they have lost the income earning capacity because of the close of their businesses. And as a result, the government will have to provide some kind of a concession to those groups. But my fear is, Jayamal, that even though there is this wish and the ambition that we harbor in providing those facilities to those people, the budget is without resources. So without resources, you cannot do anything because there's no enough income which will be generated by the government in the next 3-month time period to meet those high expenditure programs.
So, Doctor, you spoke about the government not having enough resources to even support social welfare through this budget. Let's take, after tomorrow, what sort of measures, what sort of decisions, policy decisions should the government, including the president, take to ensure that we can generate sufficient inflows, apart from bridge financing, until the IMF package is in place, to rake in sufficient revenue so as to support vulnerable communities in Sri Lanka and also to put our economy back on track?
The revenue program, Jayamal, is that already Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe had announced earlier when he was the Prime Minister certain changes in the tax structure of Sri Lanka. Now, this was actually in response to the massive tax cuts introduced by his predecessor, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, in November 2019, offering unsolicited, attractive tax concessions to income taxpayers and the value-added taxpayers. It had actually resulted, Jamal, in the loss of about 600 billion rupees per annum to the coffers of the government. The interim tax measures introduced by Prime Minister earlier, about 2 months ago, they didn't actually try to reach out to the original tax level which Sri Lanka had gotten. In fact, the senior officers of the Department of Inland Revenue had submitted a memorandum to him suggesting that he should go for a comprehensive tax increase in the tax structure in Sri Lanka, which would generate him about 1,200 billion rupees per annum. What was actually implemented was part of that. It would simply generate about, say, 250 billion per annum. So as a result, we cannot have that much of expectation for the next 3 months time period for Sri Lanka to fill its coffers. So there should be new tax measures that should be introduced, specifically given the certain hints introduced made by President Ranil Wickremesinghe at public fora recently. We can say that the rich people and the rich companies will have to pay more taxes in order to accommodate the requirements of the vulnerable people in Sri Lanka. So what I expect is that there can be a wealth tax that will be imposed on the rich people, and there can be an additional tax imposed on the rich companies in Sri Lanka. And therefore, he might call upon the rich people to share the burden of providing these concessions to the poor people in Sri Lanka.
So do you believe by making such decisions, the private sector might be strained, Doctor, or will they be able to cope well with if such a decision is made?
Well, certainly they will be strained because at present, Jayamal, even the private sector is not doing well in Sri Lanka. Most of the big businesses are not recording those super profits that they had made in the past. And they find it great difficult to meet even the day-to-day expenses and as a result, they have to borrow from the banking sector to meet their working capital requirements. So given that position held by the private sector, Jayamal, I don't think that the private sector can accommodate the requirements of the Ranil Wickremesinghe administration for this concession to poor people by providing the entirety of the resources from the private sector. Most probably, Ranil Wickremesinghe government will have to borrow from the central bank in order to meet that requirement.
So let's talk beyond tomorrow's budget, beyond the appropriation bill for next year. We know that the IMF, Sri Lanka is in talks with the IMF to reach staff-level agreement on the extended fund facility. We are hoping to generate around 3 billion through this IMF bailout scheme. However, the IMF funds will come with its conditions. They will put forward certain provisions, certain conditions that Sri Lanka will have to fulfill. Do you surmise what sort of conditions that IMF will put forward before they begin funding us, Doctor?
First of all, Jayamal, the IMF money is not available to the government for financing its budget. It is actually lent to the central bank to build up its foreign reserves so that the central bank would be able to keep the Sri Lanka exchange rate at a stable level. And the total amount which the government can expect from the IMF if the bailout package has been successful would be around 1.2 billion US dollars by the first draw that we are going to make from the IMF. And the conditions for that had already been announced by the IMF. So one of the conditions is that central bank should be made independent. The second condition is that the external debt in Sri Lanka is not sustainable, and therefore there should be a credible and acceptable debt restructuring program for the external debt. The third one is that the central bank should not print money and finance the government expenditure programs. The fourth one is that the state-owned enterprises which are making losses should start making a price charge of based on their cost numbers. And the fifth one is that the central bank should try to maintain the stability in the exchange rate and the inflation rate by tightening its monetary policy. Now, most of these things have already been fulfilled by the present government and the present central bank. And the remaining contentious issue, Jayamal, is the restructuring of the external debt. But now, according to the news that are reaching us, there is another dimension of this debt structuring has now arisen. That is whether Sri Lanka should restructure its domestic debt as well. Now, the external debt, of course, you may be aware, Jayamal, that the government had already appointed two advisors, one on finance, the other one on legal matters. Those advisors have already prepared the document for submission to IMF. But on top of that, now there is a concern which actually arose from one of the announcements made by President Ranil Wickremesinghe in a forum in Colombo about 2 weeks ago, that there can be a request by the IMF and also the foreign creditors for restructuring the domestic debt also. So if this is the position, Jayamal, we have lots of challenging issues to be resolved before we go to IMF bailout package.
So we are in conversation with Dr. W.A.Wijewardena, former Deputy Central Bank Governor. We are in conversation about Sri Lanka's economy, how tomorrow's interim budget will play a major role in shaping at least the next 3 months of Sri Lanka, which is vital. However, we must now cross over for our headlines for the primetime news. We will be right back. Stay tuned to Newsline.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
General Shavindra Silva visits the Mahanayaka Theros in Kandy. How will the national airline be reformed? Minister Kanchana's challenge to MP Patali Champika. Why is Sajid protesting? Solutions yet to be given to Chilau fishermen. Island toppers of the GCE Advanced Level 2021.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
Welcome back to Newsline Live here on Newsfirst on TV1. We are in conversation with Dr. W.A. Wijewardena, former Deputy Central Bank Governor of the Central Bank. I beg your pardon. Before we went to the break, we were talking about IMF agreements and how the IMF agreement can be structured and what sort of conditions the IMF will put forward before initiating the extended fund facility. Doctor, I want to speak to you also about the geopolitical situation surrounding Sri Lanka. We know China and India are two of our biggest lenders. They have supported us in various ways. However, there seems to be a tussle between the two countries at present. How do you assume or imagine that this particular loggerhead will affect Sri Lanka's prospects in the future, especially in terms of securing bridge financing and whatnot?
Well, what happens is that given the present foreign exchange requirements of Sri Lanka, running into about say $5 to $6 billion during the next 6 months time period, what is to be given to us by IMF would be a very small component of that requirement. As a result, both ADB and World Bank had agreed to provide some bridge financing to Sri Lanka, provided Sri Lanka would be able to enter into a workable bailout package with IMF. Supposing that Sri Lanka is able to do that, we might get another 1 billion from ADB and another 1 billion from World Bank, making it altogether about say $2 billion. But the requirements of Sri Lanka is about $5 to $6 billion, and as a result, there is still a gap of about $4 billion, which has to be met by borrowing or by getting some foreign exchange assistance from another country. Now, this is what we call the bridge financing facility, because the bridge financing to be provided by both ADB and World Bank is insufficient for Sri Lanka to meet its requirements. So what I suppose is that though government has introduced this ban on imports as a temporary measure, this temporary measure will be continued until such time Sri Lanka will have a very comfortable position in its foreign exchange position. So these are some of the challenges which we have to meet during the next, say, 5 to 6 months time period.
So, Doctor, let's talk about restructuring our debt. There have been a lot of talks about getting a haircut. That means wiping off debt and whatnot, especially when it comes to local debt. We spoke about this before the break, Doctor. And the President has also said that a restructuring of local debt might have to be conducted if the IMF requests it. What sort of repercussions will such an action have on Sri Lanka and the banking sector and whatnot?
Jayamal, the definition of the sustainability of debt of the government is that the government will be able to, in the case of foreign debt, refinance its maturing debt and also the responsibility for paying interest by borrowing from the market without using the existing foreign exchange reserves of the government. In the case of the domestic debt, definition is that the government should be able to refinance its borrowings by borrowing from the market rather than by borrowing from the central bank. Now that is why the present central bank, led by Governor Nandalal Veerasinghe, has done a lot to increase the interest rates on government securities and get the whole amount from the market rather than getting the central bank to print money and finance the government. But of course, this particular position was changed in the treasury bill auction last week, where the central bank was able to get only 60% of what was offered to the market, despite the fact that it has allowed the interest rates to go up by about say 1 percentage point. So if this is going to be continued, then Sri Lanka's domestic debt is also not sustainable. So if it is not sustainable, Jayamal, probably the foreign debt owners will insist that the local debt also should be restructured. And if it is restructured by giving a haircut to the principal amount which the government has issued, then of course all the major holders of public debt in Sri Lanka will not be able to meet the particular loss. For example, the biggest casualty will be the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. The presently Central Bank holds about 2.3 trillion Sri Lanka rupee worth of government securities. If there is a haircut of say 20%, Central Bank will have to forgo about say 460 billion rupees in the first year itself, and it will completely wipe out the central bank's the entirety of the capital, which amounts to only about 400 billion Sri Lanka rupees. So if the central bank's capital is wiped out, the central bank will become bankrupt and the government will have to recapitalize the central bank. The same yardstick will have to be used, Jayamal, with respect to the other government debt holders like EPF. 90% is held by the EPF, NSB, ETF, then commercial banks, and none of these institutions would be able to absorb the losses that would arise as a result of granting this 20% haircut. So in my view, the government should do its most to avoid this particular situation, because if we allow the domestic debt to be restructured by way of haircut on the principal amount, that will be totally fatal for the whole economy of Sri Lanka.
Doctor, I want to also talk to you about reforming our economy. At a public forum, I think you and I are speaking about the same public forum, the President mentioned that he envisages Sri Lanka being an export-led economy. If that is the case, how does the government go about supporting local entrepreneurs, local industries to innovate and to come on par with international standards so as to reform our economy and put it into a track where we can, in fact, become an export-led economy?
Well, that is the only way out for Sri Lanka, Jayamal, because without earning foreign exchange, by selling our products and services, we cannot resolve our balance of payments problems continuously by borrowing from abroad. But what matters to us is that the global economy has undergone considerable changes during the past 20-year time period, and we cannot depend on our traditional exports like garments, tea, rubber and coconut, because they are no longer the main foreign exchange earners for Sri Lanka. So what we have to do, Jayamal, is we'll have to go into these high-tech products and in terms of the goods as well as services, and sell those products to the rest of the world. There again, we have the present structure of exports in the world is that no country is manufacturing the whole product in that particular country, but they do is they actually manufacture a component of that, and that component will be supplied to a factory located elsewhere for final assembly. Now, this is called the global supply chain, but of course, this has been very aptly termed as the global production sharing networks by the Sri Lankan-born economist Professor Premchand Athukor of the Australian National University.
Right.
What it means is, Jayamal, that we will have to produce a single component and then we'll have to make money out of the volume. For example, now in the case of this iPhone, what is being earned by China by assembling the iPhone, they will get only $100. But of course, the iPhone is sold in the market for over 1,000 US dollars, and the other components for iPhone comes from 47 countries. And what we can do also, we also have to join a similar supply chain network. Since Sri Lanka is unable to do it on its own, the best way to do that is to jump onto the bandwagon of India and also the bandwagon of China and join their supply chains and supply goods and the services to those countries, which would then supply them to the final assembly point of those products. So this requires, Jayamal, a massive planning. Massive planning by President Ranil Wickremesinghe, and I hope he will put that plan into action pretty soon.
Right. We are coming into the closing minutes of the show, but I must ask Dr. Wijewardena this particular question. State-owned enterprises have been a very contentious topic for a period of time. Trade unions and authorities have been at loggerheads on privatizing or restructuring state-owned enterprises for many years. It has been a promise of some governments before they ascended to power as well, Doctor. How important is restructuring state-owned enterprises that continue to make losses, particularly Sri Lankan Airlines, the CEB, the CPC. How important is this particular act in terms of ensuring a sustainable recovery of Sri Lanka's economy?
It's actually very important, Jamal, because at present they have become a drain on the resources of the treasury. So if we have to put a stop to that, in order to do that, we'll have to get them to run on a profit earning basis. To do that, we'll have to change the management and also the strategic level of those enterprises. If it cannot be done through the ownership of the government, the best option available is to get in the private sector to do that. As you have mentioned, the unions are against it, but of course you have to market it properly with the unions. Now, in the case of the Sri Lanka Telecom, where the unions had objected to its privatization, what was done was, out of the initial shares of the Sri Lanka Telecom, the portion was allocated to employees as well. As a result, the employees became the owners of the Sri Lanka Telecom rather than the workers of the Sri Lanka Telecom. A similar thing should be done in order to avoid the objections by the unions. And it is very essential and very important, Jaimal, for the government to win the unions over to its side. For that purpose, they have to adopt some extraordinary measures to get their support.
Doctor, if all goes well and all conditions are met, this government fulfills its promises led by President Ranil Wickremesinghe, how long will it take for Sri Lanka to get back up and rise up to the potential that we know as citizens that Sri Lanka has?
In my view, Jayamal, it will take at least another 5-year time period for Sri Lanka to come back to the level which we had in year 2018, because the projections that have been already made for 2022, 2023, 2025 and 2026 are all negative economic growth levels. So we are moving back to backward in the size of our total economy. So for us to reach that level, it might take another 5-year time period, and then only, Jamal, we have to start growing.
Right. We were in conversation with Dr. W.A. Wijewardena, former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Very insightful conversation on Sri Lanka's economy, the interim budget, what are the prospects for Sri Lanka moving forward, the IMF facility, and so much more. Thank you very much, Doctor, for joining me tonight on Newsline Live. Unfortunately, that brings us to the end of tonight's show. We must now make way for primetime news on TV1. I'm Jayamal Ratnayaka for the News First team. Take care and good night.